Okay, I hope everybody's seated and welcome to what promises to be an important session. My name is Annette Young. I'm the host of The 51%, the only television program of its type focusing on gender equality on a global television news network. Now, when we came up with the idea for this panel, it was back in December. And of course, at that time, the headlines were full of Gisele Pelicot. Since then, we have found ourselves in a situation where Donald Trump is now back in the White House, and effectively all the air has been sucked out of the room, unfortunately, in that case. But what I would stress is that there is a direct line between the case of Gisele Pelicot and the fact that we are now facing Trump 2.0. As I said, in 2024, the world watched in horror as Dominique Pelicot and 50 other men were tried in a case involving the repeated sexual assault of his then-wife, Gisele Pelicot, over the span of a decade. So, will this horrific and historically important case change societal attitudes towards sexual violence and help, as Gisele Pelicot memorably said, help shame change sides? And also for us in the industry, and I think this is really important for all of us in the sector, did media coverage of this trial perpetuate stereotypes, such as the British newspaper headline describing Gisele Pelicot's decision to go public as revenge? So, joining me on this panel is Sandrine Josso, a French MP and co-founder of Don't Put Me to Sleep, a French NGO which she established with Caroline Darian Pernet, the daughter of Gisele Pelicot, in campaigning to toughen up laws against drug-facilitated sexual assault. As well, next to Sandrine is Megan Clement. I like to say that Megan and I are part of an exotic breed, Australian feminist journalist living in Paris. She is also editor-in-chief of the Impact feminist newsletter. And finally, my wonderful friend and colleague who helped create the French sister show, Actuelle, the 51% more than 12 years ago, and now managing editor of Reporters at France 24, Virginie Herz. Thank you to all of you for giving us your time. First of all, Virginie, let me start with you. As a French journalist, how did the Gisele Pelicot case impact France, and what did the media get right or get wrong in terms of covering the story?
So 3 questions at one time. Okay, the impact is really great because a new law has been discussed on rape and putting the consent in this in discussion to how to define rape. So we can come back on this point, but the impact was really great, at least on the political level. Concerning the coverage, I would say that broadly, the case was underestimated at the beginning. It's just probably when the international press arrived that suddenly French media thought, wow, something is going on. And I must admit that even at France 24, we were at the beginning pretty reluctant to cover the story because it was not an international story. We didn't see really the point. There were probably lack of resources too. And it's only because there were different women, and you, the first probably, chief editor, journalists, reporters who were in a WhatsApp group pushing to cover the story, thinking we are missing something, that finally a team was sent and then the coverage went increasing.
Megan, Virginie mentioned there the role of the international media. You yourself ended up writing an essay for the New York Times when the trial wrapped up. How much do you think did the international media really help in boosting coverage of this story?
I think they helped, but I think that the driving force behind this was women talking to each other around the world. I cannot be the only one in this room who got about 1,000 text messages from their friends and colleagues on the day this trial began, going, what what happened, but also recognizing immediately how it could have happened and reflecting on our own experiences as women. And when these discussions start, sometimes, hopefully, the media kind of follows along. So I think it started with women talking amongst themselves. The French media picked it up a bit. The international media came along, and that then boosted the French media as well. But I also think the most important driving force behind this was Gisele Pelicot herself. And what I've been a feminist journalist for more than a decade, and I have never seen such a masterclass in feminist communication in my life as this woman saying, nothing we hadn't heard before. There is no reason for victims to be ashamed. There is reason for the perpetrators to be ashamed. But the way she was able to hold the world's media's attention while saying that, and no one wanted to argue with her. And I think that allowed the media to start covering this properly as it was, and it became self-sustaining.
Sandrine, it's not just a case as a woman French MP that you are very much campaigning for this story and for this cause. It's also because you yourself, and I suspect many people in this audience are not aware of it, were the victim of sexual assault, drug-facilitated sexual assault. Could you tell us a little bit, as much as you wish to, about what actually happened, and how did the French media cover it? By the way, at this point, I just want to point out our wonderful translator, Annette Young, herself a gender journalist who's fluent in French, Arabic and English, and has very kindly volunteered to be Sandrine's translator. Annette, do you want to translate my question?
Bonjour à tous. Quand le procès Pelicot a commencé en France, j'ai été moi-même mandatée par le gouvernement français pour une mission sur la soumission chimique. Je vais vous expliquer pourquoi. En fait, en novembre, le 14 novembre 2023, j'ai été droguée par un sénateur français et j'ai réussi à m'échapper. Et lorsque je suis allée aux urgences, j'ai demandé au personnel médical sur place s'il rencontrait souvent des personnes qui étaient droguées à leur insu. Et ils m'ont dit, mais madame, c'est tous les jours, plusieurs par jour.
When, I don't know if you hear me. Yeah, hi. So she was explaining that when she was asked to talk about, to work on the case Pelicot as an MP, she recalled that she herself, on November 14, 2023, she was herself drugged by a colleague of hers, and she managed to escape. And when she got to the emergency room, and she was in a bad state, and then when she talked to them and asked them if it was something that happened, they told her that it was something that happened quite frequently, nearly every day.
Et pendant le procès Pelicot, j'étais donc en mission. Et j'ai remarqué que la presse française, bien sûr, était présente, mais surtout la presse internationale.
And so when she started working on the Pelicot case, she noticed that there was French media and there were a lot of journalists from everywhere in the world coming to cover this case.
Est-ce que tu parles un peu de comment ça a été couvert, enfin, en ton cas, est-ce que les médias lui ont parlé?
Sorry. Ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que quand ça m'est arrivé, pour être en cohérence avec qui je suis, étant donné que je suis également une députée, avant tout une femme, une maman, mais surtout une députée, j'ai pensé qu'il ne fallait pas que je me taise. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai décidé de dire ce qui m'était arrivé, pour permettre aussi à toutes les personnes à qui ça arrive d'être moins isolées, et d'être aussi moins seules, et pour les soutenir, parce que malheureusement, dans ce sujet de la soumission chimique, c'est très difficile d'avoir des preuves et c'est très difficile d'avoir un procès. Et ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que depuis 2 jours en France, ce sénateur donc il y a quelques nouvelles à son sujet, parce que le parquet de Paris a demandé un procès pour ce sénateur.
So she decided to speak up about what happened to her because she knew that being drugged is something not very much talked about and people can be scared to talk about it. And so that's why she decided to speak up as an MP. Like, it adds a certain, you know, to have it be political that way. And what is good news that comes with this very horrible thing is that a couple of days ago, it was actually announced that justice will be, you know, investigating with the MP, the senator. I don't know if we can say senator.
Senator.
Yeah. So justice is on the way, hopefully.
Sandrine, thank you. And just that shows you, and I'm very glad that Sandrine is here, because it's a reminder that this happens at every level of society. It doesn't matter where you are at the food chain, or, you know, on the food chain, but the reality is, regardless of privilege or supposed privilege or protection, you too can find yourself a victim of such an assault. Virginie, and I'm also going to direct this question to Megan as well. I think for myself, having been the host of the 51% for over 12 years, one thing I found in France is that the Me Too movement did not resonate the way it did in the English-speaking world. But as a result of Gisele Pelicot, things have indeed started to change. Virginie, could I start with you on your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that France is often regarded or considered as a very progressive country in terms of women's rights. And I must say that the government is doing a lot of femi-washing. I don't know if you say femi, pink washing. But actually, sexist attitudes, misogyny, patriarchy is still really rooted deep in society. And things are slowly changing, but it's really very slow. So we saw that at different moments when there was the Me Too movement. You remember Catherine Deneuve and other big actresses saying, well, no, we have the right to be seduced and so on. Now, there is a little bit more progress. You can see that with the Depardieu trial, for example, that there was just not not a lot of actresses, just one actress, famous actress, who came in defense on him. So things are changing, but what strikes me too is when I talk to people not coming from France, they say, well, now living in France, we noticed how much the culture is still, you know, misogynist. I was thinking of, for example, of a Pakistani photographer. She works on gender topics, and she told me when I arrived to France, I thought that, well, it's the country of freedom and of human rights, of women's rights, and finally I'm really deceived about that. And you can have a lot of echoes, but it's changing slowly.
Megan, your thoughts?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. So I think what was interesting about the Pelicot case was the ordinariness of Gisele Pelicot and the ordinariness of the 51 men who were convicted of raping her, not to mention the dozens of others for whom there was evidence, but not enough to bring to trial. These were all very ordinary people in a very ordinary village in the south of France. She looked like someone's lovely, ordinary grandmother. And so because of that, she was, in a way, a perfect victim for France. And I use that term with a lot of criticism of what's implied within it, because what we had seen before with the Me Too movement, when people came out with accusations against people like Gérard Depardieu or other famous actors or other famous politicians or people in power, as soon as allegations of sexual violence troubled people in power, I really feel that people in power closed ranks in France. And this was just, you know, any nice elderly lady that you might see at the boulangerie. And so it was when it came through that messenger that people were prepared to listen. There was nothing in it for her.
And just a little thing to add, for the, 2 days ago was released, published a report on sexism in the cultural world. And it showed that, well, the conclusion of that, it was that it's systemic. It's still systemic, and in this world where everybody knows everybody, everybody's protecting everybody. And some MP think that there is a, like omerta, you know, this word that you use normally to talk about mafia, that you don't talk. Silence, the culture of silence.
And I can certainly back that up because I myself was down in that courthouse at Avignon, and one of the most disturbing things ever in my journalistic career was standing in line at security heading into the court complex, not knowing whether the men around me were indeed some of the accused. Most of them would wear hoodies or face masks, but a number of them, regardless, walked in and out of that courtroom not in disguise as such, to the point that when I went out to get a can of Coke during the lunch break at a vending machine, a colleague of mine whispered in my ear, "The guy ahead of you is one of those accused." And of course, he looked like any ordinary person. I mean, to the degree that the French media called it Monsieur Tout le Monde, Mr. Everybody. Sandrine, oh, sorry. Yes, Megan.
I just would love to come in on that, Annette, because you told me that story and it like sunk into my soul. And it made me realize that, okay, yes, you're in the line for the Coke, there's the guy in front of you and he's accused in this trial. And that's a horrible, chilling feeling. But what I realized when you told me this was actually we are all experiencing that as women all the time. And we never know who around us is doing that to their wives or to someone that they found on the internet. We are always swimming in that water. And that's what I think was so important about this trial, is it made us kind of really reckon with that.
And I think the important thing to say, even though obviously we're all based in France, it's something that doesn't just happen in France, it happens everywhere. Sandrine, I want to come back to you. You're very close friends with Caroline, the daughter of Gisele Pelicot. And as I said, as a result of your experiences, you established this NGO, Don't Put Me to Sleep. I would like to ask you, what has been the reaction from the French political establishment about what you are campaigning for? Are you seeing increasing support?
Je pense qu'ils ont, enfin, voilà, les politiques ont été sidérés quand j'ai parlé. D'une part, parce que je suis une femme publique, et puis d'autre part, parce que c'était un des leurs qui avait osé en fait s'attaquer à moi. Donc il y a eu un grand malaise.
She said, I think they were shocked because it was one of theirs. He was a politician just like them, and so they did not expect that to be happening. And so it was mostly that shock that she felt around her.
Ils ont été peut-être pour certains étonnés du fait que j'ai décidé de m'emparer du sujet. Et j'avais beaucoup de soutien de la société.
Some of them were surprised that she would choose to tackle this subject because of what she lived through, and she felt a lot of support coming from actual ordinary people, you know, like the society.
Mes collègues de tous bords m'ont dit que j'étais courageuse.
Her colleagues told her she was very brave.
Néanmoins, ça n'a pas été facile d'obtenir une mission gouvernementale parce que le sujet est quand même très sensible.
But it wasn't really easy to get that support from the government to tackle this because it is such a hard and taboo subject.
Mais je ne suis pas seule dans cette aventure. Avec ce qui m'est arrivé, quelques semaines après, j'ai rencontré la fille de Gisele Pelicot, Caroline Darian.
But fortunately, I was not alone in this because, you know, the circumstances made it possible for her to meet with Gisele Pelicot's daughter, and that's what gave birth to the organization.
Et je suis devenue la marraine de cette association. Donc je pense qu'il y aura un avant et un après, en tout cas en France, grâce à Gisele Pelicot, grâce à sa fille, grâce à l'association M'endors pas, grâce à toutes les personnes qui me soutiennent, eh bien, je continuerai à porter le sujet pour que tous les ravages suite à la soumission chimique puissent enfin être reconnus et que les victimes puissent se réparer.
So she really believes there's an after and before Gisele Pelicot, so before and after, because of that support that she found, because of Gisele Pelicot herself, her daughter, and all the mobilization, so that, you know, like nobody gets drugged and has to live such a horrible, horrible thing. So she's mostly hopeful about that support that she saw.
Merci, Sandrine. Okay, a question now to the two journalists, particularly on this panel. I want to talk about the media coverage. Are we capable of challenging and resisting and rewiring deeply held cultural biases when it comes to sexual assault? And more importantly, how we treat or view survivors of sexual assault. Virginie.
Okay. I would say yes, we can. It's not so easy. It takes much more time than we can imagine at the beginning. Sometimes when you start, you are very enthusiastic and you think that things can change, but deeply rooted cultural bias can't be changed so quickly. Then you have to take into consideration the backlash impact that things can provoke. And I would say I'm optimistic. I think that we can change the mindset slowly, but it's never guaranteed that you won't come behind. You know, there is this very famous sentence of Simone de Beauvoir saying that you only need one crisis, political, cultural, or economical, to put into questions women's rights, and that at any moment you have to be vigilant.
I think we must do better. I think we can do better. I also maintain a level of optimism, and it is because of this case. Because at the start we saw dreadful headlines, the headline about revenge, so much about, you know, this happening to her while she was sleeping. Hello, she was drugged, you know. But these kind of, it was an education that happened over a period of this very long trial of the media stopping itself and changing tack because of the remarkable presence and dignity of this woman who just kept saying, the shame's got to change sides, the shame's got to change sides, the shame has got to change sides. And we saw media waking up to the story, then getting better at reporting it. And that gave me, as I said, as someone who's been covering these kind of subjects for a long time, a lot of hope. And we saw that she changed the minds of people in France. There were surveys done, particularly of men, saying, you know, do you agree that all men have some responsibility for ending sexual violence? And before this trial, it was the minority of men who agreed with that. And during the trial, it was the majority. I don't know if that will last, but again, the media has a role there to play to kind of continue pushing that conversation forward. So I think we can do better. I think the question is, when we have a less kind of perfect victim, when we have someone who's accusing someone in power, when we have, I don't know, in the case of France, a Muslim woman who is a victim of sexual assault, do we believe them to the same extent? Do we listen to them to the same extent? And do we treat them with the same dignity? That's going to be the challenge.
I think the most interesting thing that initially came out of the court trial was at the very beginning when details started to be published as to the scores of men. And let's not forget, there's an estimated 80 men who were accused, but some, only of 50, or 51 rather, were identified. The other 19 or so are still on the loose as such. But was the notion of what is consent. And what has happened recently in just the last week or two is that the French Parliament has agreed to add the definition of consent to French rape laws. Yes. Under French law, up until the week before last, it was threat, violence, or surprise were the actual terms used, correct? Only now, as a result of Gisele Pelicot, have they now included the concept of consent. But for the international audience here, and for myself, as you can tell from my accent, as an Australian, what was fascinating was that there was debate within the feminist community in France about whether consent should be added to French rape laws. I'm going to ask Sandrine, first of all, your reaction to that move by the French Parliament, and then I'd like Megan and Virginie perhaps to explain a bit further as to why that happened.
Ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est que en France, comme dans beaucoup d'autres pays, des sujets tabous commencent à être beaucoup plus abordés. Le consentement, en fait, en fait partie.
Like in many other countries in France, there are a lot of topics that are taboo that are kind of finally getting talked about, and consent is one of them.
Ce qui me préoccupe à cet instant, c'est comment on croise en fait les sciences sociales et la loi. Parce qu'on a tendance à tout cloisonner. C'est d'ailleurs parfois à cause de ça que les lois sont difficilement appliquées. Et c'est vrai que le sujet du consentement n'a pas amené que ce sujet-là en France.
She says she wishes that social science would cross more with the law and how we conceive, you know, like any law. And it's not just about like the question of consent, which is of course important, but it's something that is kind of like poses that question for anything that is taboo.
Ça a mis en lumière un autre sujet qui a été voté dans une loi en 2002, qui est l'obligation à l'éducation à la sexualité. C'est une loi qui n'a pas été appliquée non plus.
And there is a law that is on sexual education. It exists in France since 2002. And it was not like being used, and it kind of opened up that conversation of what happened to that law. Why is it not enforced?
Les lois sont importantes parce qu'elles permettent de mettre en lumière un sujet, mais la difficulté, elle est souvent sociétale pour les appliquer. Et c'est pour ça que sur les sujets, notamment en lien avec la vie sexuelle, la sexualité, les violences faites aux femmes, par exemple, la problématique, elle est plus de se dire qu'il faut être beaucoup plus ambitieux sur tous ces sujets-là, il faut qu'ils soient suivis. Or, ce n'est pas le cas. Donc le consentement, c'est une bonne chose, mais il va falloir que ce soit suivi comme l'éducation à la sexualité. Et pour ça, il faudra une grande politique d'État, ce qu'on n'a pas encore en France.
She says there's more of an issue with, you know, the practical side of things, like laws can exist, like sexual ed law exists, but it's enforcing them and having them, you know, happen in real life and impact society that is crucial. And so that conversation was opened up, and she says that
une grande politique d'État.
Yeah, and she hopes that the government kind of takes on, like, it needs to come from the government. It needs to be big decisions that kind of figure out how to make these laws become reality and actually protect people.
Comme une grande loi de programmation. Il faut programmer les choses. Sinon, on ne mesure pas l'efficacité des lois et on n'est pas dans la continuité et dans l'efficacité de leur application.
It needs more organization and kind of really putting deadlines.
Oui.
Putting deadlines and like making sure that things actually, you know, go forward.
Megan, I think for you and I, as Australians living in France, we were somewhat taken aback by this conversation by some French feminists. Could you perhaps give a little bit of context and history as to why these women were opposing the move?
I will, as long as I don't have to say that Australia's got it all sorted, because good God.
Not at all.
Sure. So it does seem surprising that there would be debate among feminists about whether there should be this idea of consent, or how it's been done is of non-consent in the law. Rape is partially due to the absence of consent, right? But I think it comes back to what Sandrine was saying, which is the feminist movement and the women's rights sector in France is drastically underfunded. There's a huge lack of means. And Emmanuel Macron, the president, he made women's rights the great cause of his first presidency. He then made it the great cause of his second presidency, obviously because he'd done so much the first time. And there was a lot of talk and there was very little money. And if you compare it to a country like Spain, which has recently put 8 billion euros into combating gender-based violence. So I think part of it is the feminist movement is fighting over scraps. There's so little means. And so the question is, okay, will putting consent in the law make a big difference or not? There were concerns that it might lead to re-victimization, that victims would have to prove in court that they hadn't consented. But I think the international experience of countries like Sweden, for example, shows that you can write these laws in a way that actually puts the onus on the perpetrator to prove that they sought it. But I think the division comes down to having so much to do and so little means to do it with.
Virginie?
Yes, maybe, well, I was surprised too that some feminists say that this new law wasn't a good idea, but basically other arguments they had is to say the notion of consent is not the point, really, or changing the law is not the point. The point is funding more, training police officers, training judges, giving more fundings to everything. One other point was too that yes, who has to prove there was consent, there was not consent? But me personally, I think it's a really good idea, but because until then, it was, when there was a trial, and a rape trial, there was no resistance. So in absence of a resistance, we can't prove that there was a rape. But the thing is, we know that there is this phenomenon called dissociation that I think 70% or 3/4 of persons who are raped or aggressed can't react. They are just tetanized. So this is one point that is important. The second point is that the men who came to the invitation of Gisele Pelicot's husband said that no, they weren't aware that they were raping because, okay, she didn't consent, but they had the consent of her husband. And yes, that's, well, this is France. This is just common France. So that's just, so yes, there must be the consent of the person who is, who is concerned by the thing, not her husband's concern. So this is a big change in the law.
Again, it reflects how much we all, both as men and women, all of us, internalise these incredibly deeply held biases where we normalise behaviour. And I would just throw in, there is a direct line to also the Netflix series Adolescence about all this, because it starts with misogyny and it starts with young boys. And the fact that men are not speaking out the way that they should in addressing the issue of sexual violence. The reality is to end sexual violence is a men's issue. And as one of my guests recently said, men are brilliantly articulate on so many matters, but when it comes to this, they outsource the conversation to women and others. So, that is something that needs to change. With that in mind, I want to bring it back because this is a journalism conference, and again, my last question before opening it up to questions from the floor is to the two journalists here on the panel, and that is, how do we improve media coverage? I mean, Virginie there alluded rather, to the fact that we did have a bit of an initial battle to get the powers that be in the newsroom to understand the importance of this case. But, what can we do as working journalists to improve coverage of such cases?
I would say, actually, it's find allies and discuss. You were mentioning, this coverage of the Pelicot trial arrived because of this WhatsApp group with different women journalists talking to each other. You mentioned the case that everybody, a lot of journalists were talking, or women were talking. So I think it's just like a campaign, a slow and constant campaign. I don't see any ways of doing it differently because, well, you can, of course, think, okay, how can we address a younger audience or adapt the audience or having different storytellings? All this, of course, is a kind of a reflection. But I think the thing is just considering it as a campaign that has to be studied.
Rely on the sisterhood. Megan.
Yeah, what I would love, I mean, there's so many things we need, and you're quite right about the need for male allies. We need men in newsrooms to take these issues seriously, and I have spent years and years and years trying to convince men in newsrooms to take these issues seriously, and it is getting better, but it does go up and down. So nobody cares about sexual violence, and then we have Me Too, and then everybody cares about sexual violence, but then there's so much Me Too that we actually only care about sexual violence if the victims are famous people. And then COVID happens, and so we don't care about women's rights anymore, even though it's disproportionately affecting women. And then Roe v. Wade gets overturned, and suddenly we all care about abortion. And some of us have been trying to write about abortion for years and tell you this is coming, right? And then nobody cares again, and then now there's someone who's been found liable of sexual abuse in the White House. So we have to get past this like cyclical approach to women's rights matters, sexual violence matters only for brief periods, and then it gets knocked off the front page by something else. And I think that's what should be the legacy of this trial is, okay, what if we knew from the beginning that this was going to be huge? I believe that we have it in us to do it, but it requires, you know, real vocal advocacy within newsrooms from the people who already get it, and really for the men in leadership in news to start listening a bit more and start championing this kind of difficult reporting on sexual violence more as well.
Okay, at this point I'd like to open up to questions from the floor. Has anybody got a question? Yes, we've got a couple. And can you indicate who the question is for?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Valbona Sulcek. I'm from Albania. I'm a fan of the three programs, Virginie, Annette, and The Persistent on LinkedIn. What I wanted to know is that we are trying to foster a culture of gender perspective on reporting crimes and gender-related crimes, even in Albania. But I have seen that the mainstream media is not kind of supporting that view. For you three, do you think that having dedicated media that deal with gender equality issues is more effective rather than trying to have this gender perspective approach in mainstream media, or both? So, I mean, it is rhetorical, but I want to know.
Okay, well, I suppose I can answer that, and then Megan and Virginie can follow up. You just picked up on something that I really am so terribly sorry for not saying. Megan is not from The Persistent. She came in at the last minute because Francesca Donna, who is the editor-in-chief and founder of The Persistent, had to stay in the US due to family issues. So I do apologise for that confusion. Should we do one or the other? We should do all. I would say my greatest achievement in the 12 years I've been doing this program is when I have young men in the newsroom come up to me with story ideas. Then I think, I've done something. That will be my tiny legacy on my headstone. I got young men to think and talk about these issues. It's a start. We have to start somewhere. It is a struggle, I mean, and Megan is absolutely spot on, as always, when in terms of the cyclical nature of news. We've all got the attention spans of a pissed newt, as one editor-in-chief told me back in Australia. You know, and especially now in the era of social media, we're driven by tweets or X posts or Instagram or TikToks, and we've lost the sense of understanding trends and connecting the dots as such. And the reality is, if you look at the pushback against women's rights in the last decade, inevitably it was going to lead to Donald Trump back in the White House. Because you only have to look at the way those tech bros and Donald Trump treat the women in their life to get an idea of where they stand on this issue. And if I always say, the name of my show is the 51%, because demographically across the globe, women make up 51% by and large of the population. If we can't get it right for the 51% of the population, we're not going to get it right for the other communities, be it people of colour, the queer community, and so on. That is the absolute core issue that needs to be addressed. Sorry, that's my little rant for the day. Now over to Virginie.
Nothing to add.
Megan?
No, you did it perfectly. I have nothing to add.
Okay, are there any other questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Camille Sarrazin. I'm also a journalist at France 24, and I'm also a feminist. I was really an activist up until Darmanin was arrived in the French government. Then I kind of had to rest a little bit. And one of the issues that we really were trying to push forward at the time was violence, sexual violence against children and incest. And in the Pelicot case, I was wondering why her daughter's voice, Caroline Darian, is so hard to push forward in the, why her mother is so heard and why she can't be heard as well. Why is there such a taboo around incest?
Is this a question for Sandrine?
It's for everyone, but if Sandrine
but I think Sandrine should answer it.
Merci pour votre question. Le sujet de l'inceste qui est porté par la fille de Gisele Pelicot, Caroline Darian, est un sujet qui malheureusement met très mal à l'aise en France et je pense que dans d'autres pays aussi. Les politiques publiques sur ce sujet sont absolument catastrophiques. Nous, en France, on sait que, par exemple, dans une classe une classe d'une vingtaine d'enfants, il y a au minimum 2 enfants qui ont subi déjà des violences sexuelles.
So she's saying that incest is a topic, like in many other countries, that makes people very uncomfortable. And we know that it is very present in France for, a group of 20 pupils, at least 2 have been, victims of incest. And so I think she links that uncomfortable idea with, in response of what you were saying of why it makes people more uncomfortable, and so Caroline is less heard than her mother. Oui, moi je pense que tous les sujets inceste, pédocriminalité, ce sont des sujets qui mettent extrêmement mal à l'aise et on préfère encore détourner le regard et ça c'est plus possible. Il y a vraiment une réaction de la société qui est vraiment intolérante à tout se laisser faire, mais les politiques publiques ne sont pas assez ambitieuses à ce sujet, ne regardent pas ce sujet avec tout ce qui devrait être fait et on est loin de ce qu'il faudrait faire et ça c'est vraiment une grande souffrance. So anything that touches kids makes people very uncomfortable and society does not tolerate it, but at the same time policies are very weak and so there is that need. So it makes people very uncomfortable and we want action but the policies are not matching.
Les politiques sont pas à la hauteur.
They're not,
Les politiques.
Yeah.
No,
you can say.
Being very bossy, sorry.
There was one more question from the floor before we wrap up. I think in the front row there was a question. No? Yes.
Hi, Julie Pizzetti, another Australian, sorry. There seem to be too many of us proportionately. My question is about what we've seen internationally with the rollback of gender rights and with the link to Trump. You know, the banning of diversity, equity and inclusion policies, which we have relied on to an extent within journalism and within civil society to ensure that there was accountability for sexists and misogynists and the policies that they have pursued historically. How concerned are you, from the political perspective through to the journalistic perspective, about that trend in the US, which is already radiating globally, starting to affect those organizations that are not actually in a relationship of sorts with the US, that are not dependent on US funding, and what are the implications?
We've already seen that in France with a letter being sent out by the Trump administration to French companies with trade links to the US saying that they would not be interested in pursuing a trade agreement if they have DEI policies. So you can see it is indeed having an effect. A few weeks ago, I had a guest on the show, the Chief Diversity or DEI Officer at HEC, which is the French leading business school, the French equivalent of the Harvard Business School, and she talked of great concern that basically, as we're starting to see with everything involving Trump, anticipatory obedience, where people are starting to second guess the administration and the impact it may have on their workplaces, even though the difference here in Europe, and particularly in France and so on, is that DEI is protected by legislation. And, you know, it's not driven by fear of being sued the way it is in the US. So indeed, it is a problem. I also worry about it in terms of the future of our program, because when it comes to cost cutting, and we're certainly in a situation now where budgets are under review, is the show that I produce and create under threat because it's seen as a contentious subject. I sincerely hope that a brave editorial management would realise there is a need more than ever for a show like this, given the current climate. Virginie or Megan, or Sandrine, is there anything you'd like to add? Because I'm afraid we're going to have to move on.
I'd love to add something from a purely selfish perspective, perhaps, because yes, we're already seeing it. My newsletter has lost funding and won't exist after July unless something changes. And I'm sitting in Paris, and this is happening across the sector. It's happening with USAID cuts. It's happening with the compliance in advance, where we're seeing people running away from the subject. And honestly, the last thing in the world that journalists should be is cowardly. And so we just have to keep having these conversations and doing this type of journalism and finding the means to do it and finding key allies to keep doing it with, because it's never been more important. And there is no reason why the fact that there is this administration in the US should stop journalism from happening. We're just going to have to be creative about how.
And I'm afraid at that point we're going to have to wrap it up. Could you give a warm round of applause to my wonderful panel? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.